Thank you, Joe. I'm Don First. I recently took the position of Senior Pension Fellow with the American Academy of Actuaries. Unlike my colleagues on the panel, I am now a local here in Washington, just moved here from Denver, Colorado, so hope I'll have the opportunity to work with many of you in the near future on some of these important topics. Joe gave us some significant information and research there on what's going to happen to the contributions of plan sponsors over the next several years. We'd like to try and look at what this means to sponsors and to regulators and even to participants of these plans and how it's going to affect a number of different things. The first thing I want to point out is one of the things that it's not going to affect. It's generally going to have very little effect on corporate earnings. Corporate earnings are determined by financial accounting standards that are primarily irrelevant to the flow of cash, how much cash is actually contributed. The financial statements will treat cash as an asset on the balance sheet. Once it goes into the pension fund, it's essentially treated similarly as an asset there and doesn't have a big effect on earnings. Some small effect based on the expected return of the investments, but generally very little effect. On the other hand, large cash contributions can have a big effect on companies' cash position and their ability to use cash for other purposes. How much cash they have on their balance sheet and their ability to make these contributions is a serious concern. We know that there are many sponsors who are anticipating increases in their pension contributions. They're working with their consultants and advising, receiving advice about future projections, and they anticipate increases. But the degree of those increases is very uncertain. As you saw from the sensitivity analysis that Joe presented, 1 year of widely varying investment experience can have an enormous impact on the contributions that will be required over the next 5 years. So the magnitude of this increase is very uncertain to most sponsors. The sponsors themselves also have quite a wide degree of variety. The stress that they will experience by these contribution requirements will vary enormously. Some will have very large cash reserves and the ability to make these contributions. Others may have very thin cash reserves, and this might present considerable hardship, or it might influence their ability to do other things with their business. Other strategies might be impacted by the need to make these contributions. The risk profiles of these companies varies quite a bit also. Their financial stability, their creditworthiness, their ability to generate more cash and make the contributions will vary. So while we have projected the contributions in aggregate for the system, we really can't project at this time and from the data that we have the individual effects that this has on various companies. Finally, the effect on plan participants is also extremely uncertain. If companies are able to make these contributions, that will improve their benefit security. If they're not able to make the contributions, or if they have to take some action that will be, some of which we'll be talking about in a moment, that could certainly lessen the security of plan participants or their retirement benefits in the future. So let's look at some of the potential courses of action, the types of things that might happen in the future. First of all, there's the status quo. Sponsors might not change their strategies at all, and regulators might not change the strategies that are in place whatsoever. It's been quoted several times that corporate cash in the United States right now on the balance sheet of U.S. corporations is at very high levels. Whether the problem is that cash is not uniformly distributed among all the companies that need to make these contributions. Some companies have quite a bit of cash, and the status quo will be a very good option for them. Others won't have that luxury and may need to develop other strategies. Regulators, in the same way, might say that we've dealt with this issue, as Ethan said, in the past, in at least 3 different ways, and perhaps that's all that we need to do, and we move forward and deal with the issue. On the other hand, there's other strategies that might be taken, both by the sponsors and the regulators, and we'll try and take a look at that. The sponsors has several different strategies they might use regarding funding obligations in advance and using their credit balance, potentially reducing future accruals, benefit accruals in the plans, or perhaps trying to de-risk the investments in their plans. We'll look at each of these in more detail. Regulators could do a couple different things also. They might revise minimum required contributions. That's been done in the past. It could be changed again in the future. They could also encourage de-risking. That's an option that some have proposed, and we'll look at some of the pros and cons of that. First of all, sponsor reactions. What might they do? What might the specific strategies they might use to deal with these contributions? They might just use the existing credit balances. That would be a minimum use that they would do. Joe showed you how companies have been making contributions considerably in excess of the absolute minimums in the past. They've built up these credit balances. They could gradually draw them down to lessen the impact of these contributions a little bit. But frankly, in aggregate, those credit balances won't last a long time. They could increase contributions further. They have in the past. They can continue to increase contributions above the minimums ahead of this rising tide of contribution requirements. That would increase the credit balance and give them more flexibility to lessen the requirements in the peak years. A more drastic step that affects participants is reducing or even eliminating benefit accruals. We'll look at the impacts that might have on plans and individuals. They might also de-risk their asset allocation. That generally involves, de-risking involves lessening the equity exposure that pension assets have and lessening the volatility. And finally, they might come to Washington and request more relief. That's certainly a possibility of something that might happen. So let's look at each of these a little bit and how they might do that. With a credit balance, sponsors can temporarily mitigate the impact of a funding requirement by using that credit balance and drawing down. They use it essentially as a cash contribution. But I would comment that they can only do this in certain circumstances. There are threshold levels of the funding ratio. So if we have a very poorly funded plan, you cannot use the credit balance to satisfy your contribution requirement. That was part of the Pension Protection Act. You have to actually make cash. So for some companies, even with a large credit balance, that might not be effective. Large contribution requirements can also exhaust, if you are able to use the credit balance, it may be exhausted before some of the really peak contribution years come, which are 2015 and 2016. So the credit balance is only a temporary solution for most sponsors. Next strategy was to fund more in advance. Firms with available cash can do this. The sooner they put the money into the plan, the more investment return it can earn, and it can lessen the peak requirements of contributions in the future. Funding in advance primarily affects the timing of these contributions, not the overall amount that the sponsor needs to contribute to the plan. It does decrease it some small amount if the investments do well. So additional investment earnings will improve the funded ratio and lower somewhat the requirement. But primarily, funding in advance is a timing issue. You fund it sooner rather than later in order to lessen the peak requirement. Reducing benefits is the more extreme situation. If the cash drain is significant on a company, they might decide to lower pension accruals. Now, they can only do this if the plan is an ongoing plan with active accruals. As you probably know, some sponsors have already frozen benefits, and this would not be a viable strategy to help them. Future accruals can be reduced through a redesign of the benefit formula, or they could be eliminated through a freezing of the benefit accruals. But in either of these cases, the accrued benefits, the benefits that people have already earned based on their past service, are not affected by this. Those accrued benefits are protected and are part of the plan. If an organization did this, their cash contributions would be lowered, but they still might have significant contribution requirements to amortize any unfunded liability. this strategy does not eliminate your contribution requirements in the future. It can mitigate or lower them, but it certainly won't eliminate them. Even that decrease that they might experience could very well be offset by any replacement plan costs that they might have. So I'm sure you're aware that many companies that have frozen pension plans in the past have then instituted an enhanced defined contribution plan of some sort with a larger contribution. So if a company would make a larger contribution to a successor plan, whatever the cost of that is going to mitigate the cost, the contribution requirement to this plan. And usually contributions to successor plans like DC plans are cash requirements also. You have to make that as a cash contribution also. Finally, if there were these kind of changes in benefits, companies would probably expect some adverse employee reaction. That's certainly something that they consider when debating about whether or not to implement a benefit decrease. So there would be employee reactions to this.